Good afternoon, everybody. No, fischia. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I'm afraid the audio is a bit too loud. My name is Francesco Strazzari. I invite the directors of the Institute, Dear Policy Institute of the Scuola Sant'Anna, Andrea De Gutri, and the director of the School of International Studies, Andrea Fracasso, to stay with us for the first 20 minutes for some institutional greetings. Let me just say a word of welcome for everybody who is here today, and to thank our distinguished guests for joining us over a conference, an international workshop that was organized with the contribution of both the Dear Policy Institute and the School of International Studies in Trento on the topic of insurgencies, very much topical, I would say, and the idea of organizing it together with Emanuele Sommario and Luca Raineri has been going around for quite some time in the effort to develop trans and cross-disciplinary lenses for analyzing the mechanism of violent mobilization and the countering of insurgencies in today's international landscapes. Attention will be given to matters of state and non-state governance, rebel governance, questions of stabilization, legal implications, and also these 2 days will give us the opportunity for displaying some research that is being done by young researchers, PhD researchers at the Scuola Superiore Sant'Anna. So it's a rather varied program, but I will shut up here and leave the floor maybe first to Andrea De Gutri for some home welcome, and then to Andrea Fracasso.
Thank you, Francesco Strazzari. Good afternoon to all of you. Let me warmly welcome the students of the first year of the MIS here in Pisa. I wish you since the very beginning a very nice and intense period in Pisa. Let me as well greet those students who have finished their first year and who are now moving to Trento for their presence. And let me express my most sincere thanks to Francesco Strazzari and his team for having organized this event on a very complicated, controversial, and sensitive issue. Before spending 2 words on the topic, let me just tell you that in my capacity of director of Dear Policy Institute, and for those students who start now the MIS, you will see me as well in another capacity, namely as one of your lecturers. And I think I am the one who starts first my course early in the morning, which is something which I know everybody of you appreciates. And your colleagues of the last year, they were happy. They were even asking me to start a little bit earlier if possible. We can work on that, no problem. Let me just greet you in my formal capacity of director of Dear Policy Institute. The Dear Policy Institute at present is some kind of department which brings together the lawyers of the Scuola Sant'Anna, all of them, a few economists, and a few political scientists. So quite interdisciplinary approach within Dear Policy, which is reflected very much in this initiative, which inevitably is looking for an interdisciplinary approach. We have a lot of responsibility inside the Institute, just that you are aware. We have the responsibility for organizing the master and the 1-year master, and we are responsible for organizing the PhD courses, while the undergraduate program are not in the responsibility of the Institute, Dear Policy, but of the Faculty of School of Political Science, Law and Economy. So whenever you have a problem which is strictly related to the organization of the master, to the content of the master, you are kindly invited to make reference to Francesco Strazzari and his team for the content, the logistics, the way it is organized, and I really appeal to you, as I did last year, to your colleagues. If there are any problems, please let them know us as soon as possible. Don't wait till the very end when we cannot try to solve the problem. Just let us know as soon as possible. You should understand that we are very much problem-solving oriented. We would like to offer you a period in which you should not have any kind of significant logistical problem, but you should have a period in which you really can concentrate yourself on the content, on the different topics which will be delivered during the classes. If you have any major problem, which I do not expect to happen, with Francesco Stazzari and his team, you can come to me. If you have any problem with me, in my capacity of director, you can go to the rector of the Scuola Sant'Anna. Let me just highlight that inside Dirpolis we have paid an increasing attention to all the issues related to security. As you may know, there are quite a lot of different activities currently being organized around this topic, which are training activities. Just to give you an example, you may know that we won a major tender to provide the compulsory training for the all EU staff on safety and security. So all the EU ambassadors, all the EU officers going to higher critical risk countries, they have to come to Pisa, to the Scuola, to do a 5-day training course in which we try to help them to understand how to mitigate the risk, how to understand and how to react in the case of a significant risk occurring to them. In this very moment, and I am pleased to share it with you because there might be opportunities for you to mix a little bit with them, we are organizing as well a training course which started today and which lasts 12 days for the EU aid volunteers, which are those people who have many of them very similar interests like you, and they would like to go in the field to serve in different typologies of international operations, such as post-war reconstruction, conflict prevention, reorganization, doing capacity building, training, including the security sector reform. So I think it is a unique opportunity for you to melt a little bit together with these colleagues. You know that we have as well a few PhD courses which are around the notion of security. And we are organizing a lot as well of research activities. I don't bother you because I think that something has already been anticipated during the opening session. But if you visit the website of the Dirpolis Institute, you will notice the different research activities we are carrying out in topics related to security. And my invitation to you is be curious. Don't be afraid. If you see anything which looks interesting, appealing to you, don't hesitate to speak to the professor who is in charge, or the researcher, or the leader who is in charge of that specific research project and say, I'm here for 1 year, if I can contribute, if I can do something. This happened in the past, and hopefully it will happen as well with you. And don't forget to visit as well the website looking to the training activities. Beside the one I was mentioning, there are quite a lot of other training opportunities which might be of your interest to contribute to in one manner or in the other. We try to involve you as much as possible, provided there's an interest from your side. The last comment I wanted to do on the general issue is some kind of commitment from the side of the Scuola. As a public university, we are spending most of our time in delivering research activities. Whenever we launch a new master or a PhD or a course or a training course, we do this only if there has been a significant amount of research behind this, because our goal is to bring into the classroom the outcomes of the most research activities carried out inside the Scuola, and you will have the opportunity in the next weeks and months to get a little bit acquainted with all those junior and senior researchers involved in different projects, or research is carried out by other institutions. So this is one of the key characteristics of the Scuola and of this master, and I would like to make this clear since the very beginning, to give you the opportunity at the end of the master then to remind us continuously our commitment and to evaluate if we have really been able to promote this accordingly. The second key characteristic on which we insist very much is that we pay special attention to the training methodology and teaching methodology. We perfectly understand that you are not undergraduate students, that you have a lot of expectations, that you will acquire not only knowledge, but as well skills and to a certain level attitude. Our commitment is to go in that direction. Your resource persons are very much committed in trying to use all the most advanced training methodologies. If you're unhappy with them because you feel that the professor is a typical Italian, very boring professor, just let it know to Francesco Stazzari and he will take the measures which are necessary to make sure that the training methodology or the teaching methodology is according to your desires. Finally, 2 words on the topic Francesco Stazzari and his team have been chosen. Congratulations. I think it is a very, very relevant topic in general, but it is very closely related to the interest of the MIS and of the Dear Policy Institute. Being a little bit curious, I paid a visit to a data bank which is called Invisible Armies Insurgency Tracker, where they list all the cases of insurgencies from 1775 to 2012. Now, I don't ask you how many cases have been registered for Italy in that period. I tell you 7. But quite interesting, the number of cases considered by this database as insurgency in the more recent period in Italy, and I was really surprised, are 2. One has been qualified as insurgency by the Italian resistance movement against the Nazi occupation of Italy. So we are at the end of World War II, the so-called Partigiani. And the other one are the Red Brigades, terrorist group fighting against the state and trying to change the state. My first impression is that there is a need of some kind of clarification. There is some kind of confusion. Even more, I don't know if you noticed, in a recent article which has been published on The Economist of June 21, I quote the title of the article, Anti-Migration Political Insurgencies is Making Life Hard for Angela Merkel. Once more, probably we should clarify and use a common wording when we speak about insurgency. And I think that the approach you have decided for this kind of event is very important. It must be an interdisciplinary approach. As lawyer, and I am a lawyer, we have some kind of pretty clear definition of who are the insurgents according to mainly international humanitarian law, which doesn't correspond with the notion of insurgencies according to the political arena, which probably doesn't fit anymore to the evolving situation, which changed significantly after the Geneva Conventions on the international humanitarian law. Therefore, I think this is a unique opportunity to deepen a little bit the knowledge and to understand what is happening in this area, which is becoming very important and in need of new ideas how to deal in a more proper manner. Having said this, once more, thank you very much for having decided to spend your next year in Pisa and the following year in Trento. We know that it's a huge amount of time you are devoting to us. We feel very much responsible and we are fully committed, and I think I can speak in the name as well of the director of the CIS in Trento, to do our best to make it worse to have spent these 2 years in between Pisa and Trento. All the best.
Thank you, Professor De Guttri. On the back you see that there are some links. We are being streamed, just for you to know, and live tweets will be sent during our conversation. Andrea Fracasso for the Scuola di Studi Internazionali at the University of Trento.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. Let me start by thanking the organizer of the conference, of course, the Dear Policy Institute, and also the director, Professor De Guttri, for sharing these opening remarks. I would also like to thank in particular the coordinators of the 2 directors of the MIS program, so Professor Strazzari and Professor Pertile, we sitting there and speaking tomorrow, and of course also Professor Barbara Henry, who started the program with Marco a few years ago. So this is an ongoing common activity that we've been carrying out, since I would say 2010, something like that. As has been said, both the School of International Studies and the Scuola Sant'Anna are sui generis institutions, so they are interdisciplinary. They are interested in international studies, so they are peculiar in Italy at least. And this makes the programs peculiar as well. So this is interesting for you as students participating in the program, because you can see how two different institutions work, that you have more professors to deal with, you have more opportunities that are offered by both the institutes. So, you know, somehow you're unique as well. But of course, anything that is unique actually is also raising a number of challenges. That's why I share perfectly this invitation to speak and say if there are problems emerging, if there are good things that you particularly appreciate, if there are suggestions. So we are somehow a twofold community, a double community, joined to offer the best to you and also ask your full collaboration and cooperation. So exactly because sometimes problems emerge, well, it's important to have a team which is dealing with them, and so this is the reason why I would like to grab the opportunity for thanking and really giving my appreciation to both professors and the other members of the junta, so the directors and the members of the junta, and also the administrative staff. You know that the Italian system is particularly complicated from the administrative viewpoint. Sometimes you will have to face rules that you will find not completely reasonable, but rules are rules, and so please stay with us and help us to abide by the rules. So the administrative staff is an important component of the normal functioning of the master. So let's say the world is changing, and the international order has changed a lot, particularly in the last 10 years, but of course many other things will happen. So we see that democracies are under threat. We have illiberal democracies, we have populism, we have a number of threats. Then we have security threats to the, let's say, to the territorial integrity. We have problems and issues with human security. So to deal with these kind of challenges, it's very important to have an interdisciplinary approach. And this is the reason why we do share, as has been said before, the feeling that we have to commit and provide good research, but also to, you know, do the best for educating a generation of young professionals and young scholars that can see these phenomena through different angles and using interchangeable lenses to understand what's going on. So let's say that the problems and the complexity of the phenomena are also increasing. They are strengthening our resolve to do the best in joining forces to produce the best master possible. Again, your collaboration will be clearly important for the program to succeed. When you will be in Trento next year, you will see that the school is a small community. It's more or less like the Scuola here and the Dear Policy Institute. You will see many similarities because we have a faculty that covers law, international economics, politics, sociology, languages. So you will see even there the same multitude of, let's say, disciplines represented. Again, different from the ones you will find here. So that's why I said that you have double opportunities. Of course, once you will be in Trento, and I will tell you this again probably next year, please feel free to talk to me and to the director in Trento, Professor Pertile, in the same way and according to the same rules that Professor De Gurti told you at the beginning. So there are, of course, different problems that can be addressed by different people at different moments. But even now, in case you need some clarifications or if you want to just start a little bit ahead of time and plan for the next year, of course, you can reach me by email, and certainly you will have the members in Trento that participate in the junta running the course. About the conference, so I'm glad to be here. I will be learning a lot, hopefully, because I'm not an expert in the field. I'm an economist, actually, but I know that there's going to be a session covering also the issues that are connected with that. And so we will have opportunities to discuss about these issues also, during the moment, the break times that we'll have. So again, thank you for the invitation, and have a nice conference to everybody.
Right, thank you to both directors. And while we change maybe and we allow the first panel to take a seat, I would ask Luigi Narbone to be the chair, and I want to thank him for the opportunity. Also, I would like to just say a couple of things in terms of housekeeping before that. Today we just have one session, and then we will, Virginie and Morten, if you want to come and take a seat. Meanwhile, Fabrizio as well. Emin Poljarevic is on his way from the airport. We just got a message from him. He's taking a taxi, so should be here any time. I just want to say a couple of things very practical and logistic. Today we just have one session, as you see. Tomorrow morning we have something rather unusual for an international workshop. We have a breakfast session, and when we say breakfast, we mean breakfast. There will be coffee and something to eat served. So that at 8:30, so rather early, our PhDs will introduce, and will be facilitated by Tina Gade in doing that, their preliminary research on topics that have to do with insurgencies, armed violence in the Middle East mainly, but not only. And this will be just a 1-hour methodological introduction to the next two sessions, one with a clear cut on international law, and the second one more on economics, reconstruction, stabilization. There will be refreshments offered, and we hope that this will create also a climate of exchange. Other than that, I already showed to you that we are online. If you need washrooms, they are just opposite this door along the main hallway. And if you need any other information, we have Luca Raineri sitting here raising his hand. There's myself, there's Emanuele Sommario who's sitting at the very bottom. We can help you with anything you might need. Feel free to come and turn to us. Just one word of introduction for Luigi Narbone, who will be chairing the next session. He's the director at the Middle East Direction Program at the European University Institute, the Robert Schuman Center. Has a long and distinguished experience as a diplomat in the Gulf, in Saudi Arabia, and in the other countries in the Gulf, but not only, also in Latin America, and with the External Action Service of the European Union. Already in the profile of our distinguished guest, you see that we chose to keep open a dialogue between the merely academic, the practitioner's profile, the diplomatic aspect, and all the broad dimensions that we think we should keep in mind when dealing with such a slippery topic as the one that we are setting to discuss today. Luigi, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Francesco. Good afternoon to everybody. It's a pleasure to be here and open this very interesting and topical question on some of the most pressing issues concerning the level of violence and countering some of the dynamics in many regions. Insurgency, we used, as has been mentioned by Professor De Guttry, has been one of the key issues for a number of years when looking at the confrontation between non-state groups and the power of the state. We have been witnessing over time a clear focus on for instance, a number of revolutionary movements throughout history. But as we moved on, and particularly entering in this very complex phase in international relations, we seem to be entering into a much more confused characterization of both of the actors involved and the dynamics involved. If we look at, for instance, in the Middle East, which is the area where we the program, the Middle East Directions Program, focuses its efforts, There are a number of conflicts where it's difficult to define the state according to traditional Westphalian characterizations. As the state is weak, there are a number of regions and sub-regions which are no longer under the sovereignty of the state, which has lost the monopoly of force, leaving rise to insurgent movements, sometimes defined as terrorist movements, sometimes defined as violent groups, in a very confused continuum of groups which not always are contesting the power of the state, but sometimes are there to engage into complex conflict dynamics, which is perhaps other issues as the objectives, such as the control of resources, the control of minorities, and issues related to governing territories in absence of state power. So it's a complex situation that we have to look at, and I think the multidisciplinary approach is certainly the best one. It's very difficult to come into this area with a monolithic IR approach, or even traditional political science approach. I believe that a number of disciplines are necessary, including anthropological and sociological studies, and including a look at the political economy, the dynamics of certain regions, which become sometimes as I said, the objective of the violent groups and non-state actors, but also trigger new dynamics in the confrontation with the state, which render very difficult the exiting the conflict situation. So all that is extremely complex, and we have today, I think, four very interesting and knowledgeable researchers looking at different aspects. And the first panel, of course, as you see from the title, will look at this difficult relationship between insurgency between state and rebel governance, with the governance aspect being, of course, extremely important in how the whole issue of insurgency is looked at and sometimes confronted in military or political terms. I would, without taking too much time, it's probably more interesting to have an open discussion when we get to commenting on the presentation. I would open the floor, giving the floor to Martin Blamm, who is a researcher, professor in the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs. He works predominantly on issues concerning peace and conflict in Africa, including issues such as land rights and citizenship conflicts, youths, ex-combatants, and new landscapes of insurgency and geopolitics. Dr. Boas has co-authored and co-edited a number of books and published several articles for academic journals, and has conducted deep, in-depth field work in a number of African countries, traveling extensively across the continent. Today, I think it will focus on try to get some overview using a comparative conflict research approach, particularly using his extensive African experience. Martin, please.
Should I go over there?
Yes. We are going to have a presentation around 15-20 minutes, followed by a Q&A session, let's say of 10-15 minutes at least, and then perhaps we can have a last session after having listened to all researchers to go over across the board over the four presentations over issues that are overarching and encompassing all the topics treated today.
Thank you for those kind words of introduction. My name is Martin Blamm. I'm a research professor at NUPI, Norwegian Institute of International Affairs. Happy to be here in Pisa for the first time, visiting Professor Strazzari and his younger colleague, promising and splashing Luca Ranieri, seeing Alessandra again. Great to be here, and looking forward also to have at least a little possibility, opportunity tomorrow afternoon to also explore Pisa, which is supposed to be a beautiful town. I don't know, we'll see. Anyway, I'm happy to be here, and I shall try to use my time sensible and not just stand here talking rubbish. But this presentation, I ended up calling it All Armed Men Rule, ? No gender biases here. I think you could say also all armed people rule, ? Perhaps the reason why I called it all armed men rule is that predominantly the movements that I work with these days, which are more of the jihadi insurgency brand, tend to be extremely male dominated. That's not to say that women do not at times play an important role on the sidelines to these movements, but I mean they are predominantly all male, these movements. And that is for me a little bit of a change, because I used to work in the I've also done work on insurgencies both in DR Congo, in northern Uganda, and also in Liberia and Sierra Leone. And particularly in Liberia and Sierra Leone, there were also important female commanders, and there were females also who actively took part in the fighting. Most of these histories are unfortunately been a little neglected and overlooked because they didn't fit into this overall frame of women as victims of war, and therefore very few people were interested in writing their stories. I think that's a pity. I mean, these are also stories that should be heard. Anyway, I mean, that is not what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about what I call violent entrepreneurs and this concept that I'm trying to develop together with Francesco Strazzari of governance that comes and goes, and I get back to what I mean by this. But it's about the provision of order in Sahel peripheries and how insurgents rule, how they mimic state practices, but also how they try to establish some sort of alternative governance modalities, suggesting that first, even though I'm not going to talk so much about it, and I think that some of those who have heard me before are probably happy that I'm not yet once more is going to be bashing this concept of ungoverned space. But just to make it clear, there is no ungoverned space. It doesn't exist. It just exists in the minds of very silly people who have never actually been in the field to see what is going on. Ungoverned space is built on some sort of Hobbesian version of the world, but then you forget that what Hobbes constructed was an ideal concept. It's just a think piece. Men or women cannot live in that kind of world. There will always be some attempts at establishing some sort of orders, because life without some sort of orders is simply not possible. So I'll be trying to talk about that and how this provision of order in Sahel peripheries is established, both independently but also vis-a-vis extremely weak and dysfunctional state structures. In doing so, I will be drawing on and trying to sort of further develop a conceptual comparative framework that I put together in a book together with my good friend and colleague Kevin Dunn, in a book that was published last year called Africa's Insurgents, Navigating an Emerging Landscape, where we are trying to suggest a whole new comparative way of looking at insurgencies, basically. So I'm trying to sort of further develop some of these ideas. If we look at armed actors' authority, because we need to talk about authority here, I believe that the ability to collectively use force almost automatically bestows some form of authority on those that are using force. I'm here talking about collective use of force, not some individual gunman, but some sort of collective use of force. It will give the users of force of violence some form of authority, but it will also differ tremendously in form reach effectivity and also legitimacy. It will differ from, on the one side, the left extreme, if you like, of a continuum from roaming, loot and plunder movements to stationary forms of more systematically service provision and crude tax collection. It's not only states that collect tax. Insurgencies also tax. And the embryonic research on this matter shows, at least from the cases that we have in Africa, that there is a huge difference if and when an insurgency sort of turns from purely having a relationship to local population based on loot and plunder to one that is some sort of crude tax collection. It changes the game in quite some ways. We can get back to that. But in between these quite established dichotomies, which very much draws on the pioneering work of Mankir Olsen, we find more flexible forms, what we may call sporadic governance. And this is a type of mobile governance that comes and goes. And such insurgencies does not attempt to gain more permanent territorial control. What they aim for is some social control of a targeted population through a combination of unpredictable coercive activities, while also sporadically all offering some governance services. So how do you gain a grip on local populations if you are an insurgency, even a jihadi insurgency? Well, one way of doing this is to try to appropriate local grievances. By this we mean their ability to make use of local cleavages, pre-existing local cleavages, as land rights conflicts or disputes over trading rights in order to further their integration in local communities. Our research on a number of Saharian-based insurgencies have shown that they have fine-tuned such strategies for decades. They know how to do this. They know how to use these kind of violent strategies in order to get a grip on local populations that enables them to some extent to integrate locally. Or alternatively, attacking state institutions and practices that are seen as corrupted and dysfunctional. And believe me, there is a plenty of these in these kind of regions, particularly in the more peripheral areas. If state agencies exist at all and try to perform certain functions, they are most often seen as either just dysfunctional or dysfunctional and also completely corrupted. They are not seen as benevolent actors at all. They are mostly seen as, at the best, a nuisance. The role of the water and forest agencies in the Mopti region of Mali is, for example, one good example of this. And how local insurgencies has made use of the immense unpopularity of these aspects of state power, attacking them in order to get a grip on local populations. But it could also be about distribution. We have to remember that insurgencies do not only steal and extract from local populations, they also at times distribute. This could be money, it could be medicine. We know, for example, that Akim, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, has distributed both. They have money at their disposal that they can distribute locally. We know that they have distributed medicine. There are people in Akim ranks who know who has some small but still much needed medical education and know how to do this. SIM cards to young people, pop-up cards for for cell phones, etc. All of these things matters. Or simply by trading, paying a decent price for goods brought locally. When some years back I collected stories concerning what Akim fighters paid locally when they bought a sheep or a goat. And what we found was that they, by and large, paid slightly over the actual market rate. Imagine the kind of image that you then create of yourself. When all people are used to, from figures of authority, is that they take what they want and throw a little bit to you. And suddenly comes somebody and asks you for a price, and then when you, because you're afraid, you put the price low because these guys have guns, he will tell you, no, that's way too cheap. You're selling yourself too cheaply. This is a fine goat. I'll give you so much money for it. I mean, the importance also of branding yourself as being pious, as a pious fighter. This also matters here. So there are many ways of appropriating local grievances in order to get a grip on a local population beyond simply terrorizing them. And this is what we need to become better at understanding. Of course, without neglecting the fact that these groups also behave at times extremely violently towards the very population that they either claim to be fighting on behalf of or are trying to get a grip on through local integration. That's why I was stressing in the beginning this combination of unpredictable coercive activities and sporadic provisions of services on the other side, and how they balance this. Sometimes they're not able to balance this, and they're juggling things that doesn't go very well together, and then it falls down on their heads, but also, unfortunately, it falls down on the heads of the local populations around them. But still, I mean, they are trying these delicate acts of balancing these kind of things. If we then move into one empirical example and look also how is this played out when we talk about enabling environments? What constitutes an enabling environment for an insurgency that has certain aspirations of also governing in some way or another? I believe that central Mali is a good example of this. Mopti, which is the capital of central Mali, and this is the region just below the north in Mali. I should have had a map, but for some reason I took it out of this presentation. Mopti was once the commercial capital. Now it's undergoing a huge economic downturn. Pastoralist has become increasingly vulnerable. Drastic reductions in herd sizes, combined with reduced demand and plummeting livestock prices across West African markets. Right now, we reckon that only 33% of livestock in Mopti are currently sold, meaning that people are holding on to much larger flocks than they actually are able to put to any, at least, monetary use. Tourism, which used to be an important sort of segment of income for this part of Mali, represented 20% of the regional economy, has completely vanished. Something happens to a local economy if 25% of it simply vanish. Something happens then. And it's not rocket science to say that something bad happens when such things occur. You have acute poverty levels of over 70% in this part of Mali, and very low levels of literacy and school enrollment. Men, only 21% compared to Bamako, 72%. Women, 10%, Bamako, 52%. Compared to other regions in Mali, Mopti and Ségou recorded lowest net enrollment rate in primary and secondary school. And it's getting worse. Last year, UNICEF estimated that 270 more schools have been closed due to the insurgencies, leaving 80,000 children out of education. This is what may be an enabling environment. If we then look at one of the main insurgencies in this part of the world, Haradan Kufa, and what is sometimes known as the Mazina Liberation Front, or the Katiba Mazina, or just Kufa's boys, or just the boys in the bush. They go by many names. But you know that Kufa is a well-known and respected Islamic Fulani preacher from Niafunke. In Mali, in Mopti, who has been active in these parts of Mali for decades. He has links also to other insurgencies, more nationwide regional insurgencies like Iyad Agali and Ansar Eddin, which again is part of this new superstructure they have established of Sahelian/Malian insurgencies, the group for support of Islam and Muslims, JENIM. But it's also interesting to see that apart from these wider connections, I mean, the Katiba Mazina promotes a much more local agenda when it initially claimed that it was seeking to restore the Dina, the theocratic Fulani pastoralist empire that existed here in the 18th century. Kufa's group, in my point of view, drawing on both political science and classics of anthropology like Marshall Sahlins, they resemble both a big man network and a classical guerrilla insurgency. With Kufa very much as the big man in control of a group of people that is known as the Katiba Masina, or Kufa's men, that provides directives to other decentralized networks of relatively autonomous Katibas, who again affiliate themselves with Kufa's brand. This is an insurgency organized as in a much more network manner than we are used to. But things can quickly split up again and then be fused together at a later point in time. They depend on the local population for resources, combats, auxiliaries, informants, but also reverse, making civilians dependent on them through the provision of basic services and some sort of governance. It's not about necessarily control of territory, but it's about a kind of social control. Clearly, there are also other drivers here, state responses. The Katiba Masina, mainly but not exclusively from the Fulani pastoralist community, but I would like to stress that the majority of the Fulani has not joined and has probably no interest in joining either. But they do appeal to the sentiments of marginalization and stigmatization of pastoral communities that have seen their socioeconomic status reduced. And these communities have been particularly vulnerable to water and forestry agents of the state and cattle raiding from other communities. But the breaking point was the clampdown on Fulani pastoralist communities after the French intervention in 2013. That triggered some increased radicalization and mobilization of this community towards the Katiba Masina. Why did this happen? Well, it's a very long story, but to cut it short, what this story shows is very much what a mosaic of different local conflicts a warscape like this actually is. Because in 2012, some Fulani communities who feared a Tuareg hegemony, they allied themselves to Mujau, another jihadist group, not necessarily because they suddenly had turned jihadists, a whole lot of them, but they were very much afraid that since the Tuareg groups was in the Ansar Eddin, another insurgency on the move right then, they could lose out in local struggles over access to water, land, and not the least trading rights. So underneath this larger picture of jihadi conflicts, it's this mosaic of local conflict that gets initiated and becomes more violent as things fall apart, as the social fabric unravels around them. So quite predictably, when Malian security forces reappeared here in 2013, this led to an ethnic profiling of Fulani herdsmen as jihadists. Mass arrest, abuse and torture followed, and it has continued more or less unabated since 2013. So this continues to fuel recruitment and mobilization towards Kufa's men. What about the role of religion? Much discussed in all of this. It's an important vector, but in my point of view, not a critical factor. That said, the egalitarianism they promise may have some appeal. The slaves of God argument, for example, which promises some sort of egalitarianism, which probably has never been reached and never will be reached. And it's also interesting to see the wider reach of Kufa's preaching. We are currently in a project that I have with Tine Gade, who is also present here, and we will be sharing and discussing papers on Syria tomorrow morning, I believe. We are collecting Kufa's preachers as they are spread on memory cards, Bluetooth, and so on, and they spread like wildfire through communities in the Mopti region and beyond, even in Bamako. So if I were to try to sort of go up again from this Mopti material and talk about what is then this all about? What does it tell us? Well, I think it tells us that in an enabling environment, you can govern on a shoestring. And that is what these guys are doing. They are governing on a shoestring budget. You can govern on a shoestring if you can offer people an alternative where none really exist. And a very innovative thing that Haradan Kufa and the Masina Liberation Front has done is their mobile courts. And people are quite impressed by the mobile courts they have established. Often we heard things like this when we interview people about them. It's just like the state, but it works. This is harsh and violent justice, but this is justice that cannot be bought, and it's instant. Decisions are taken and implemented. And this is not something that people are used to. What they are used to is that in the past, if they brought something to a local state court, the case would drag on forever as various court officials try to siphon off as much money as possible from all the participants to this. Here, I mean, people are just summoned by Kufa's men who are armed. They are ordered to lay forward their case. Kufa's men hear their cases, they withdraw for an hour or two, and then they offer their judgment. And people know that if you don't abide with it, these guys, they have ways of getting that knowledge. They will be back, and at the very best, you are in for a severe beating. Most likely, they just plant a bullet in your brain, and then they leave. Example made. This is harsh and violent justice, but it cannot be bought, and that gives it some legitimacy, because it's seen as more impartial, more neutral. Land management. They claim that they are re-establishing the DINA principles. The DINA principles are the principles of land management that was laid down by the theocratic DINA empire that I briefly talked about. They're not really doing this because that's way too complex, and they really don't have neither the capacity nor the power to do this on a larger scale. But what they have done is, for example, opening up the dry season pastures for use without people having to pay for it. And this is at least popular in the short run. Although, I mean, Haradan Kufa and his men may creating their own little or quite large version of Hardin's tragedy of the commons there. Because this is a common, and it has to be governed in one way or another. Just opening up, saying that this is the land of God, is not going to solve the resource problem, which is very much real here. But my point is that you can govern on a shoestring budget if there is no credible alternatives, and your approach is of the governance that comes and goes type, that combines unpredictable coercive activities. In other words, violence with some service provision, when both activities, that means both violence and the service provisions, are dressed up in a pious, religious, political language. Finally, do I have 2 more minutes? I hope so. Yes. Some concluding comments for what they have heard. What, in my point of view, what characterizes this is not the lack of governance per se, as the ungoverned space arguments claim, but rather the density of actors locked into a violent competition to introduce alternative orders that cannot easily be reconciled. This means that what we are talking about here is not a new embryonic hegemonic order, but permanent competition where neither insurgents nor state actors and their international supporters are able to move beyond the governance that comes and goes approach. In this regard, I think that the governance on offer by international community actors share many similarities with those offered by an insurgency as the Katiba Masina. Because this is precise, apart from the violence, I mean, MINUSMA don't go in and kill people, at least they only kill people that they claim are terrorists. But it's very much the same. I mean, MINUSMA also comes and goes there. They move into a village, try to re-establish some state functions, then move out again because they don't want to be in that village when dark comes. Then after dark, the Katiba Masina men comes back, de-establishes what the MINUSMA has established, and so it goes in one big vicious cycle that they are not able to break out of. So in many ways, I mean, the international community practices and those of the insurgents they have some very, very striking similarities after all, although they are maybe done for very different regions. So, in conclusion, just as the Katiba Masina, MINUSMA, which is the large UN operation in Mali, is just an order provider that comes and goes, which, in my point of view, tells us that focusing on such similarities may tell us more than the opposite view. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Martin. I would have a number of questions, but I prefer to open the floor for questions to the audience first. Any reaction, comments, questions? Otherwise, I will take the privilege of the chair just to launch the debate and see. Perhaps it's a question that can be looked at also when we have listened to the other panelists. But certainly, perhaps is my bias as a former practitioner, policymaker, quote unquote, is the reaction from the part of the international community to reestablish state governance in these regions. First of all, I'm struck by the similarity of the dynamics you have described in the case of the Katiba Masina with other similar movements we have seen, for instance, in Iraq with ISIS, but in many other places in the world. One of the issues is, I think it's very interesting what you in the end describe as density of actors, a permanent competition between state, or whatever it can be called, state, and non-state actors, part of the insurgency movement. And in terms of responses, certainly, as you described, the weakness of the international community response in aiding local states in reestablishing governance when there is this incapacity to ensure continuity and long-term commitment is one of the issues. So, yes, govern on a shoestring is definitely what's happening. I still wonder how good the quality of this governance is in the long term for the local communities, in development terms for those territories, and in terms of reducing the level of violence and conflicts for regions, entire regions. So, in your opinion, I mean, it's looking at a response issue. Just give a quick fast answer. What would be needed to break this permanent cycle of competition and the fragmentation of governance?
Thank you. It's an important question and one that I have been pondering for quite some time. But in my point of view, I mean, obviously, I mean, I'm not saying that the Katiba Masina is the answer, because they are not. I mean, they are not the answer to the much larger problems that are so deeply rooted in this region. I'm just saying that right now they are perhaps more effective than the international communities. And I think the first step in doing something with this problem is realizing precisely this, realizing that right now we are locked into we are part of this group that is competing for being relevant to the livelihoods of local people. And right now we are not the most relevant. And we have to start by realizing that, and then we have to look at our strategies and how we have framed this entire international operation, which in my point of view has been framed in extremely narrow anti-terror, anti-migration lenses. And I'm not saying just open the gates and let people move. I mean, that's not that is obviously not an alternative, and it won't do anybody any good. But we need to refocus the whole approach to conflict and development in the Sahel. We need to strike a much better balance between our security approaches and our developmental approaches. And then we need to figure out, okay, these are the resources we have. How can we utilize them the best that we can and most effectively to give people adequate protection, basically. And that may mean that for a time being we may say that, okay, let's forget about the North for now. We need to put all our resources into re-establishing something that looks like a legitimate state in Mopti and Segu. And then basically saying that the North will have to go for the time being.
Very good. If there is no other quick question to the speaker, I think we can move to the second speaker, who is Virginie Colombier, is a part-time professor at the Middle East Directions Program at the EUI in Fiesole, and she will talk specifically on the case of the Libyan armed groups as new and power networks in Libya. So we'll listen to her, and then we continue the debate on the issues we have started and other issues that will be raised by the audience, of course.
Thank you, Luigi. Thank you very much, Francesco and Luca, for inviting me today. I hadn't planned to be standing, and I have quite a messed note in front of me, so I hope I can make something clear out of it. First of all, I would like to say that I have spent much of my time working since 2011 on Libyan issues, more specifically on reconciliation issues, the development and expansion of armed groups, and also more recently jihadist movements. And so when Francesco sent the invitation, looking at insurgency was not exactly the kind of focus that I would immediately adopt, having worked extensively on Libya. I think, especially starting from a very empirical approach and field-based approach, there were two ideas that came to my mind when trying to frame this presentation. In the case of Libya, after 2011, you see basically two trends or two main dynamics that can be of interest if you want to look at insurgencies, and more specifically this issue of the relationship between state and rebel governance. And I think the most immediately, the one that comes to mind the most immediately would be, of course, jihadist movements and how the jihadist insurgency, the Islamic State, has developed and have taken root in Libya after 2014. So this is the first model, if I may say, that I will maybe try to look at. How to explain that in a post-warfare country like Libya, and countries still experiencing warfare, and in a situation when you have had a continuing collapse of the state institutions, how can you explain the development and the expansion of a jihadist insurgency, more specifically the Islamic State, in this specific Libyan context? And here, I think most of the elements that were highlighted and underlined by Martin in his presentation on Mali are also quite relevant to understand the Libyan case. I will come back to this. The second idea, the second element that came to my mind is much less obvious and less immediately related to the issue of the insurgencies. But I've been asking myself, well, what does that mean exactly to talk about state versus rebels in a context when you've had a continuous deterioration, a fragmentation of the state, where the state institutions have been eroding considerably and even collapsing. And here, what we've seen since 2011 is something maybe more subtle in terms of what is the balance of what is the nature of the relationship between the power centers and those armed groups that have been conflicting, sometimes with the institutions, but also sometimes between themselves for controlling the institutions. And I think if we want to maybe fit better with what the current dynamics are on the ground, it might be interesting to question a bit the relevance of this insurgency model, state versus rebels. And I think in the kind of context when you have a very fragmented state with collapsing institutions, the rise of, the rising influence of new actors, and especially armed actors, and the way they interact with the new power structures and new centers of power is also something to look at, especially if the idea is to analyze the kind of threat or the nature of the threat that is also affecting the state and state institutions. So in this very tentative presentation, which is not the theoretical framework so far is clearly lacking, I'm trying to put together a number of ideas and observations from the field, and it's a very, very, the very first stage of this analysis. But I think these two elements have to be looked at. So first of all, if you go to what I would call the traditional model of insurgency, I think focusing on the development, rise of the Islamic State in Libya is something that makes sense. It fits quite well with this idea of how groups contesting the legitimacy of the state are using some local dynamics to really take root on the ground and mobilize some of the local actors and some of the local conflicts to their cause. And I think, for instance, I've been working quite a lot on the case of the city of Sirte, who is a Libyan city located in the coastal region, more or less midway between the capital, Tripoli, and Benghazi, which was also the kind of stronghold of former leader Muammar al-Gaddafi, and which was marginalized after 2011. And after a few years of this situation of exclusion, because it was the stronghold of the former leader, and because there was a power vacuum in this city, have become the strong bed of the Islamic State in Libya. Here again, I think a number of elements can be highlighted to understand what happened. And here, the model fits pretty well with the Mopti case. I think one of the key issues has been first a kind of situation at the country level in which you have first a situation of deep fragmentation among actors and communities, with the incapacity of the new power center located in Tripoli to bring the pieces together in some ways and become a kind of legitimate, recognized authority for all. In the specific case of Sirte, you have another problem which is being identified of the kind of stronghold of the former regime, the situation of exclusion and of power vacuum. The tribal component in the city Sirte is also something very important to understand. You have a city in which you have an important fragmentation of the tribal component. And you have several tribes that have been competing for power. This has been even more so after the collapse of the Gaddafi regime, where you clearly have those former groups that have been ruling after 2011 being excluded, and new tribal groups trying to use the opportunity to gain power. And a situation in which the central power is not recognized and is not providing support for local governance. And here this issue of the kind of exclusion, lack of presence of the state, and lack of legitimacy of the central state made it much easier for an external group to come, take root, and provide a number of, play on local conflicts, which is something that's extremely important. Power vacuum on the central level, but also the existence of local conflicts on which the jihadist insurgency could take root, actually. And this is something that has been key. I will not maybe enter too much in details. We can discuss this more, but again, here I think the kind of governance model which has been put in place by the Islamic State between early 2015 and end of 2016, when the insurgency was expelled after a long military battle, also highlights that you need a number, or you have groups, these insurgent groups that are capable of using local context, but they also provide something. And here, this capacity of the insurgent group to provide the kind of protection and order that have been missing in post-2011 Sirte has been key. And I think going back to Morton's presentation, this is also a very, very important aspect. You not only have a situation in which you have a group using violence, because this is something that should not be forgotten, that contest the state and try to provide another model for governance, here using, in addition, the ideological reference and the religious reference, but also providing actually on the ground a number of institutions that allow the organization of local life, regulating conflicts, providing security and order, which have been key in a post-warfare context. This, I think, are very important and is key to understand how this kind of insurgency or insurgency groups can adapt and use local environments to their own benefit. And this is also key in thinking and reflecting how they can be defeated, not only by military means, but also by political means. Again, I refer to Morton's presentation. We have lots in common in this. This is one model. I will not spend more time on this. I think it's also important to look at the second model, and more precisely what I would call the kind of rise of armed actors in the new power networks in post-2011 Libya. And here I think it's directly the consequence of this emergence of armed actors as one key element in the new power networks is important and has to be related or to be analyzed in relationship to two main issues. The first is the importance of warfare context. Situations when you have civil wars, sometimes international conflicts, and the effect these warfare situations have on local communities and have on the state structures and the state institutions. And the second point is exactly the second point, which is what's happening and how can you analyze the relationship between these armed actors and the others in a situation when state institutions do not exist or are so weak that they cannot organize a competition between these competing actors looking for influence and power. And this has been extremely obvious over the past 4 years in Libya. I think to understand what's happening in this moment, it's key to bring in the analysis some dimensions that have not traditionally been used when you look at insurgency, maybe state-rebel governance. Here we are at the kind of crossroad of how, state institutions get fragmented, but also how the international action, here I would say how the action of the United Nations have been important in reshaping the political context, trying to reconcile between rival factions, bringing to life this government of national accord that was born at the end of 2015, but pushing for this agreement without having secured the support of all the major competing factions in Libya. This has led to something which indirectly, and not, of course, it was not the purpose, but instead of reunifying the state institutions and reinforcing them, has led to a situation of further division in which two rival centers of power have emerged after the end of 2015. One clearly directly supported by the international community and the United Nations in Tripoli, and another one which was not considered legitimate but could reinforce and expand its influence, especially in the eastern region. And here you see that beyond the formal institution framework, you have the gradual emergence of two rival power centers that put together, or at least link together, a variety of actors with very different in nature and very different in interest, which in both cases have gradually given increase and major power to those actors that have the control of force on the ground. On the one hand, you have this multiplicity of armed groups in western Libya and specifically in Tripoli. On the other hand, in the east, you have gradual militarization of power that also gives specific influence to those armed actors that now are key. They are key why? They are key not because they are contesting the state. They are not proposing another or an alternative model of governance. Instead, it's more that you have these groups competing with one another and trying increasingly to get in touch and to build common interest with other actors. Political actors, of course, those who are now the key leaders in these new power centers. So politicians, members of the parliament, those people who are political feeders and have some authorities in some ways on the political field, but also businessmen, people that are well placed in the administration, people that can allow them to access a number of resources. And this kind of connection and the building of these new networks, linking together political actors, armed actors, business actors, is something that has become extremely important in the new power map of Libya, in different ways in the West and in the East, but gives, again, a key influence to those actors with military power, and not within the context of institutions. So the state does not exist anymore in the sense that you have no unified institutional structure, and you have now, let's say, kind of, big networks competing with one another, but mixing actors of different nature, which, of course, have a clear interest in preventing the emergence or the building or the rebuilding of the institutional architecture of the state, which is, of course, a different kind of threat to the state and institutions, but now is also becoming a kind of pattern, and I think we can also see the same kind of model in other contexts. If you look, for instance, at Iraq and the developments linking together actors in the military field, political sphere, and business community is also something that you see increasingly dominant as a pattern of I would not say governance, I would say power. Because here it seems that the major objective is not so much to govern and to provide order to communities, it's more to really seize control over key instruments for making decisions and accessing resources. And in that sense, I really think that it's one issue or one dynamic that has to be analyzed more in depth, because it's constituting most probably now one key challenge to the existence of the state and the capacity of a legitimate state to exert its authority and provide good governance on the ground. This is why I would say that even though immediately this role of the armed actors in new power networks doesn't fit so well with the insurgency model, I think if you look also in terms of policy relevance, what are today the major obstacles or the major challenges to the provision of order and legitimate order to communities in given countries, this has become a key challenge. And this brings us to maybe one of the subtitles of this conference, which is we cannot look at this phenomenon without adopting a multidisciplinary approach. If you long to, of course, my initial starting point was more, I was looking at things in a more political science, traditional perspective. When you start to bring in, and you have to bring in business actors, the business model of armed groups, you have to look also at the sociology, anthropology of these groups, and you cannot do this adopting a pure, for instance, again, political science approach. So I think these kind of meetings are also very relevant, because we can maybe share not only analysis of some specific cases, but also looking together at what kind of lenses can be adopted and can be used to look at phenomena which have become increasingly complex, intertwined, and that cannot be looked at in a relevant way, at least through a pure one discipline approach. Thank you.
Thank you, Virginie, for adding this new dimension of extreme competition between power networks, which encompasses the political, the military, and the business element in a situation of in which the very existence of the state has been put in question, and extremely difficult to conceive and facilitate a process in which the authority of the state comes back and taking control over the situation, competition continuing along very, very difficult lines. After the case of Libya, I think we can move on. I understand that for the needs of streaming, it's better to collect all, to have all the Q&A session at the end, even though that may. So I encourage you to keep track of the pressing questions that you have had and raise them all at the very end of the 4 sessions. So I think now we perhaps can continue following the order with the presentation of Emin Poljaverić, who's associate professor of sociology and religion at Uppsala University, and is been studying the range of motivation behind the mobilization of young Muslim Brotherhood activists in Egypt, and also I think is focusing particularly on the issue of Salafi confrontation and how to avoid that this confrontation ends up in full war among Salafi groups. So, I mean, the floor is yours.
Sure. Thank you for that. Thank you for the invitation. I just came from Sweden, where we have 2 degrees Celsius to the summer. So it's quite pleasant, actually, even though I'm a bit late and stressed. But I don't have a PowerPoint presentation, so I'll just give this introduction to my current research, which is connected to this project that we have in Sweden at the Department of Peace and Conflict Studies. We have this huge database at the University of conflicts around the world. I don't know if you're familiar with it. If you're not, go to Uppsala University website and try to see the database that we have that you can use, definition of civil conflicts and other types of conflicts that you can utilize. This presentation is called Prospects of Reducing the Total War Mobilization Among Revolutionary Salafis. Very easy title. So I'll try to address essentially what I'm currently working on, and that's, in a nutshell, the possibility or to explore how certain Salafi groups, jihadi Salafi groups, I call them revolutionary Salafis, are pragmatic enough to negotiate peace with, right? In various contexts now. So I'm very sorry to have missed Morten's first part of the presentation, because I've been looking at Mali myself a bit, and I'll bring maybe an example or 2 from there. I also looked at Libya, not so extensively as you, but I've looked at the prospects of peace resolution in Libya from the bottom up, so to say. So my focus there was really looking at the non-existent state institutions as we know them. During the Gaddafi reign, he was essentially, in my humble opinion, he had an interest to keep the state institutions weak in order to govern the country in a specific way that he did, and that enabled later on this kind of a brutal fragmentation that we are still experiencing in Libya, for instance. Now, this project that I'm a part of is called Islamist Armed Conflicts and the Prospects for Conflict Resolution. So my kind of paper fits in there rather well. Now, there's this kind of a range of different Salafi organizations and groups. So in the beginning of my project, I tried to look at what is Salafism, essentially. To try to define the terms, terminology, try to see how this reflects the various contexts on the ground, both in the Middle East, but also in Europe. So there are then a range of Salafi organizations. One useful way to conceive what Salafism is then is to view it as a methodology, really, not really as an ideology, but as a methodology by which to interpret Islam, written large. So Islam, in this sense, meaning methodology to interpret its scriptures, its history, its tradition in general sense. Because what we see that Salafis oftentimes use across the board, both those quietists or pietists, those activists, and those who are revolutionary, you would see that there's a similar way of looking and interpreting the sources, but the methodology by which then this is applied or translated into activism is rather different. So that maybe can orient you towards what Salafism is and what it maybe not, or maybe is not. So this is a kind of a long backstory of what that might be. Because it's a rather new phenomena. If we look at the word Salafism as like Islamism, is a new phenomenon. We didn't have that type of term, well, maybe a century ago, a century and a half ago, definitely not. But maybe a century ago, we start to see at least Salafism used as a term describing a certain way of interpreting or living Islam. But enough of that. I'm thinking to focus on this shift from pietists or activist Salafism to the more violent type as we see it today, this kind of revolutionary Salafism, as I call it. So we have this kind of a well-used genealogy of the Salafi methodology, is that we have 4 generations revolutionary Salafists. 4 generations. We are now in our 4th generation of revolutionary Salafism. These generations are essentially outgrowth from different contexts within which we have seen conflicts happening around the world. So the first generation oftentimes is used as saying, we have seen this development and active combat, active way of doing war in the field at the end of 1970s, right? So that's that kind of a Arab volunteers that came to Peshawar and then to Afghanistan to kind of help out the Mujahideen struggle against the Soviet Union, right? That's the kind of a first generation. And what I'm looking at oftentimes, when I look through that type of analysis, I'm looking at the key people who have done that. So my focus in this part of my research is to look at who said what to whom, and how that resonated with people that this person was talking about. And the key person here is Abdullah Azzam, if you have heard of him. If not, Google him. Abdullah Azzam is one of these few people who are essentially Islamic scholars and who have explained what jihad really means in contemporary era, right? So he was this kind of a key person who could translate the political situation in Afghanistan and around the world to Arab audiences, and he attracted a significant number of people to Afghanistan to fight the Soviet Union, right? So I'm looking at his work, for instance, his texts. How did he do that? Because there were some other people, contemporaries to him, who are Salafi scholars now, religious scholars, who also believed that he was right. Why? Because this was the war of defense. Right, there's a big difference now. This is the Muslim majority population of Afghanistan defended themselves against the aggressor from the outside. So that even the pietist Salafi scholars, primarily in Saudi Arabia, were telling, yeah, this is all right. We support this, right? And that went on to the next level, and this is what we call kind of a birth of the second generation. After 1989, when Soviet Union withdrew its troops and Mujahideen proclaimed victory, we have, well, before that, but we have now a different context. We have it was essentially 96, 97, when the Shura Council of Mujahideen, foreign Mujahideen in the Afghanistan noticed, now we are winning this war. Now we need to think about how to take this fight elsewhere. We need to broaden the scope of the fight. So we see the key kind of a shift from defending Afghanistan against Soviet Union to take it elsewhere. now you have to redefine the enemy. Who is the enemy now? We see the Soviet Union was the enemy. Now we have to redefine and see who is the enemy. Al-Qaeda was formed in this type of period, right? We have a birth of Al-Qaeda, and then after the war, 89, it was not really the end of the war, but after the end of the foreign occupation, you have the civil war about who's going to run things in Afghanistan. And that's where the context comes into place, which is quite specific, or it's quite special for Afghanistan, because you have a lot of ethnic groups, right? Taliban, who were born from this kind of a struggle, were majority, what? Ethnic group. From which ethnic group were Taliban born from? From Pashtun, right? And you have the Pashtun ethnic group, which is the largest one, essentially interpreting their hardcore notion of Hanafism onto the minority groups, ethnic groups in Afghanistan, who are Hazara, who are Uzbeks, who are Turkmen in the north, right? And you have this kind of a struggle now between the alliance of the minority groups against the majority group, all of them claiming Islam to be their primary motivational force and legitimizing their struggle against the other. Now, that's one thing. The other thing is now to focus that this struggle that is taken from Afghanistan, from the formation of the network, is not really organization, because I don't see, in my view, Al-Qaeda was never really a full-fledged organization, but it's a powerful network of personal contacts who then are taking this struggle elsewhere to redefine the enemy. And here I found Carl Schmitt being extremely useful, and his model of political theology. Political theology as a concept is really something that I'm using in my work to understand the definition, a redefinition of enemy-friend relation, right, in these various contexts. And this is where the state comes in later on. So the second generation of revolutionary jihadis are born, and then this struggle is taken from Afghanistan to Algeria primarily, to Bosnia, to Chechnya, to where else? To Egypt, of course, and then to Philippines, right? And then you have this kind of a broadening of the network, because you have these different various Muslim majority groups in various contexts, various pockets of these regions, fighting for what? Oftentimes fighting for independence, like in Chechnya, right? Like in Bosnia, or like in Philippines. So now you have these brethren coming to help out, and also taking with them their experiences from the Afghanistan, their understanding of Islam, to areas which have not experienced this type of enemy-friend distinction. You understand me? So, and this then becomes the kind of a broadening of the so-called ideological understanding of what revolution, or what the state should do, or how we should organize our state, and also the defining who the enemy is. Because the enemy is not only the Russian state, or not only the Serbian state, or the Philippine government, or whatever it might be. It becomes much more entrenched in that. Because the true essence of globalization, in this sense, if you want to see it that way, is to see the whole world as your playground, right? So we see that the civil war in Somalia also produced, after a decade, a really jihadi component which was not there from the beginning, okay? And then we have 2000s, and that's the kind of a third generation, because that's taken further. So what happened after 2001? Well, we have, again, the occupation of what? Of Afghanistan, and then, of course, of Iraq. And we have then Somalia receiving another, if you remember the Sharia court, Sharia courts, the organization was called the Sharia courts, right? It was born, it established control of southern Somalia, really stabilizing the country, ending the civil war in the south, and it was not allowed to exist, of course, because the Ethiopians came in and occupied the country in 2006 after 6 months of rule. So, and then Nigeria comes into the picture, and also Philippines become far more radicalized in a sense. 5 minutes? All right. After 2010, we see this kind of a fourth generation of jihadists that we are now in this phase that we are now in, and here we see that form of total war mentality that was manifested by ISIS, right? We have that kind of a, and in my own project, I try to see what the doctrinal differences are between ISIS and Al-Qaeda, because we already know that, we already have that. And I study very intensely the text of Abu Bakr Naji, the Management of Savagery, which I think it's the pinnacle of this evolution that started in 1970s until today. And for that reason, I'm using this kind of a theory of political theology, and now more recently, Carl Schmitt's more sophisticated theory, which kind of translates into the theory of the partisan, right, the insurgent, and how that is manifested. Now, I take a case study in Egypt of Jama'ah Islamiyah, which essentially went from being social activists to being hyper-violent in 1990s to ending the violence in 1997, 98. I think I take that as the example where you can see that it is possible to transform and to negotiate with revolutionary string of Salafi movement. And what are the conditions then? Well, conditions for this to work is essentially to take it case by case. I mean, Egypt was really an exceptional case if you compare it to Algeria, where you had essentially a total war between the jihadi Salafis, the revolutionary Salafis, and the regime, where the civilians and no one was spared. And you have 200,000 plus deaths in Algeria, while you only have maybe 1,500 of deaths between the struggle between Jama'ah Islamiyah and the regime, because Jama'ah Islamiyah did not target the civilians, and also the regime did not go in and target the civilians more explicitly. They sure did held hostages, they executed people, but most of them were convicted in these kangaroo courts, or military courts, and they were executed. But essentially, it was a total different experience. Now, I'm looking a bit that the Algerian liberation war from the French occupation was really something which manifested itself in the civil war in 1990s. And how is that? Well, that's in my opinion, that's what makes Algeria an exceptional case in comparison to Egypt, because of the civil liberation war experience against the French. In just one last point, what was the difference? Egypt did not experience that type of liberation war. Algeria did. And when Algeria went through the war, it was very brutal. The rebels, or the liberators, or the rebels against the French colonialism were essentially very, very harsh to their own people, who they understood to be traitors. So you have this kind of a very visceral and high-level violence against what they understood as to be traitors. While in Egypt, the Jama'ah Islamiyah never saw the regular civilians as being traitors to their cause. They just view them as being ignorant of the importance of the cause that they are trying to bring about, and that is the Islamic State in Egypt, for instance, to remove the regime. This later on was translated into a revision of the political theology of Jama'ah Islamiyah, saying that we should not fight leadership, even though it's not a good Muslim, but he's still, Mubarak was right? So he's still a Muslim. That's why Muslims, this kind of a theological argument, Muslims shouldn't be fought in that way, right? While GIA, the armed group in Algeria, they viewed the whole society as being, so their conception of the enemy included the whole society who was not part of their own doctrine, right? So that's kind of where I'm at this moment, so to say. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, I think it's it's quite interesting to look at the different cases, and perhaps from the debate we could go deeper into the issue of how this differentiation can be used to bring down the level of violence, as you said, in the case of Egypt, perhaps avoid full-fledged confrontation with violent Salafi groups. Then I would perhaps pass to the last presentation by Fabrizio Coticchi, who's an assistant professor of political science at the University of Genova in fields of research of foreign policy, contemporary warfare, strategic culture, political parties. It's quite broad range of issues, and is looking at some of the lessons that can be drawn from the case of the Vietnam War.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Luigi. Thank you so much, Francesco, for the kind invitation. It's a pleasure to come back here, where I worked hardly for several years. The aim of my presentation is to try to connect the existing literature on insurgency, so peace and conflict studies, with different kind of literature, for instance, foreign policy analysis, military innovation studies, and comparative politics, in order to identify some issues that deserve further attention in the literature. So try to emphasize key elements that can be useful for you as students, for master thesis, PhD, and papers, I hope so. The inspiration of my presentation is based on my current research on contemporary warfare, on counterinsurgency operations in Afghanistan, and undertaken by especially Italian armed forces, and is also inspired my personal interest in the Vietnam War. Why the Vietnam War is relevant here? For mainly two reasons. The first one is that very easy to understand, is one of the most studied events in terms of insurgencies. And the second one is that it's quite interesting to see how Halberstam called the best and the brightest in the both Kennedy and Johnson administration in the 60s were unable to address the complexity of the war. The best minds in US, most of them coming from the former dean of from the Ivy League, like McGeorge Bundy, weren't able to understand properly the context of war. And so this is relevant here in a university of so-called excellence. So among scholars, I think it's crucial to better understand lessons of the past. Some months ago has been published by International Study Perspective an article that called conflict and peace studies as a divided discipline between those who study peace and those who studied conflict. I share this perspective, and my argument here is that there are at least four main issues that deserve additional research in this field, and it's crucial to look at what happened in other kind of literature. I try to emphasize two issues from the domestic side, the domestic dimension, so the counterinsurgency dimension, and two issues related to the features of insurgencies. The first dimension is the domestic one. It's related to the Putnam two-level game, so the relationship between domestic and international level and the role of domestic actors in waging war or waging military interventions like counterinsurgency operations. In this case, the Vietnam War provides a lot of examples of studies on civil-military relationship, the debate on the war lost in Washington or lost by media, a lot of analysis on this point. But at the same time, if we look at the most recent development in other fields, we can add something regarding the role of domestic actors and counterinsurgency operation. I refer, for instance, to foreign policy analysis. Quite paradoxically, the role of domestic actors in shaping foreign policy decision has been, in a sense, understudied, even by foreign policy analysis, as stressed by Juliet Carbo in her seminal article of 2015. Two key actors are emphasized: the role of political parties in terms of ideology, in terms of their role in coalitions, and especially, and this is my first issue, the role of parliaments, the role of parliamentary oversight, the control of the parliament toward the executive. And this is my first issue, and I'll come back in a moment on that. The second one is the growing debate in the literature regarding the role of strategic narratives crafted by political leaders in order to convince public opinion to support counterinsurgency operation. And this is related to the branch of studies more connected to the communication studies and other literature. Also in this case, the war in Vietnam provides a relevant and useful example regarding, first of all, the relationship between the parliament and counterinsurgency operation. At that time, President Johnson said that this is a different kind of war with no marching armies, and we don't have at that time a declaration of war. Rather, we have the famous Tonkin Resolution in 1964, and this is crucial to understand even the feature of the operation in Vietnam, because the Congress, the US Congress, supported a limited war with limited aims. Some scholars say that the fact that the war was fought with cold blood, with these limits, represented a crucial obstacle to winning the war. But the aim was not a total victory, in that case, against the North Vietnam. So looking at the role of parliament is crucial to understand the relationship between domestic actors and counterinsurgency operations, and the role of Congress in US, especially at the beginning of the 70s, was crucial because Congress posed a lot of obstacles to the Nixon administration to still provide military and especially financial support to South Vietnamese. Moving from the example of the US to Western Europe, there is a growing body of literature in Europe focusing on the causes and consequences of different parliamentary oversight regarding the executive. So works by Mello, Wagner, and many others, focusing on some European countries, but not all European countries. So, for instance, Italy still deserve attention. Here, it's crucial to see when we have a weak parliamentary control, what are the consequences of the weak parliamentary control in terms of lack of audience, or what Firon called the audience cost for the executive, the lack of a clear attribution of responsibility for the executive. Thinking about the difference between Germany and Italy, almost 1/3 of the military operations in Italy have been approved without a specific parliamentary approval, while on the contrary, in Germany, we have a weekly control of the executive. Thinking about the military operation in Afghanistan, every week we have debate in the commission, in the Bundestag, because in Germany there have been approved specific rules regarding the control of the executive, while in Italy only in December 2016 we have a new comprehensive law on military operations abroad. And concerning a very complex operation like a counterinsurgency operation, I think it's crucial to better understand what are not only the causes but also the effects of a weak parliamentary oversight. Maybe it could be useful also to look at the literature regarding the role of drones in counterinsurgency operation and the role of technology that can reduce audience costs for executives and political leaders, and I'm referring to the article by Sarah Krebs and Horowitz published a couple of years ago. So the first issue is the role of the parliament, that, in my opinion, deserve additional additional interest. The second aspect, as I said before, is the role of strategic narratives. There is a growing literature concerning the role of plots elaborated by political leaders in order to convince the public to support complex and difficult operations to understand for general public, like peace building, peacekeeping operations, and even more complex counterinsurgency operation. And the literature say that there are some aspects that define a successful strategic narrative, like consistency with the situation on the ground, coherence, the lack of a compelling counter narrative, and an effective communication. Also in this case, the example of the Vietnam War is very useful. Thinking about at the turning point of the war, the Battle of Tet, the beginning of the 1968, so the plan elaborated by General Giap in southern Vietnam, which, in a sense, the literature considered the turning point of the war. But why was the turning point? Because it was a complete failure in military terms at that time, but was the event that, in a sense, shocked the American public at that time. And so the approach of the public towards the war completely changed after that event. But why? Because some months before that event was launched a strategic campaign in terms of communication by the Johnson administration, along with General Westmoreland, who was the commander in Vietnam, in order to convince the public in Washington that the war was a success. Some scholars say that the media, US media lost the war, but these analyses are not based on strong empirical material. On the contrary, the media support the US military intervention until 1976, and only after the Tet, the situation completely changed. So by looking at the role of strategic narratives, in this case, a complete failure, the narratives elaborated by Johnson and Westmoreland, so-called the optimism campaign, the rosy picture provided to the public, we can better understand also the relationship between counterinsurgency operation and public opinion. This is not the case, for instance, regarding recent Western military interventions, like in the case of Italy, where we had huge lack of coherence between the situation on the ground and the narratives adopted by political leaders. But in this case, the crucial explaining variable for the shift in support towards counterinsurgency operation was the role of counter-narrative. But this field of research needs additional empirical analysis in order to better understand what are the explaining variable of the change in support of counterinsurgency operation and the role of strategic narratives. My third point is related to insurgencies. And here I deeply suggest to follow the research by Theo Farrell, who tried to connect the growing literature on military adaptation and military innovation. Farrell studied the UK counterinsurgency operations with the broad literature on insurgencies from the perspective of the organization of forces, the organization of rebels. So starting from the seminal work by Grissom on military innovation, Farrell said that we need to combine this kind of literature with the existing debate on the structure, the governance of rebel. Looking at the horizontal networks within insurgency, so looking at the structure, looking at the centralization, so the command from the Quetta command in Pakistan to the Viet Cong command in South Vietnam, the role of leadership, the role of doctrines, the role of ideology, obviously, and the role of the external support for insurgencies. And according to Stathis Kalivas, this last point helped to distinguish, for instance, jihadi rebels from Marxist rebels. So look at the horizontal networks within the insurgency, and obviously look at the vertical links with the host country. So the attempts, as stressed before by previous speakers, to try to conquer hearts of minds by insurgencies. And Farrell said that we need to combine all these literature in conflict studies with the growing debate on military innovation, how rebels and insurgents try to innovate and adapt on the ground, from tactical level to strategic level. And also in this case, the Vietnam War provides a lot of examples, but also contemporary counterinsurgency operations, thinking about the very complex struggle between the Taliban and the insurgencies in Afghanistan and the Western forces concerning improvised explosive device. So also the role of technology. One of the biggest novelty in terms of military adaptation in recent years is the strategy adopted by the Taliban, the so-called green on blue attacks. So try to attack the trainers of the military operation, the NATO military operation in Afghanistan, in order to try to contrast one of the most relevant aspects of that operation. Another element that further stress is the role of, obviously, social resources, the role of governance adopted by rebels, and especially the need to try to examine both the strategies based on territorial control and strategies based on non-territorial control, so mainly through the role of terrorism. So in sum, try to combine the huge literature on military innovation on the ground with the broad debate on the structure of the rebels organization. And my last point is related to, more related to comparative politics. As you maybe know, there is a broad literature on power sharing after conflicts, and especially a huge attention devoted to the role of rebels that then became political parties. The attention is devoted to the role of the executive, so the power sharing at that level, the role of electoral roles, the phase of disarmament. However, according to my view, there is a gap in this kind of literature, the lack of attention devoted to dynamic interactions among political parties, and former rebel groups, within local and national legislative assemblies. So the debate, the day-by-day interaction among political parties in post-conflict scenario featured by power sharing at legislative level absolutely needs more attention. The way through which political parties, which were former rebel groups, try to frame the grievances that you stressed before, and here I refer to the amazing book by Sederman and others on the role of grievances in post-conflict scenario. How political parties develop, once again, narratives regarding the previous war, how they shape emotions. And here we can connect this kind of literature with a growing debate regarding emotions and civil war, and I'm referring to the article International Security by Ruggeri and Costalli related to the case of Italy. So try to better examine the day-by-day interactions among political parties within legislative assemblies. And this is connected to my very last point, which is not a literature, is not an issue related to the literature, but is more related to methods. So why we don't have a lot of analysis concerning these dynamic interactions among political parties, among elites within the legislative assemblies? I think that this is related to ethnocentrism, because if you provide analysis based on discourse and content analysis, you should know the language. So as we can see in our Western academia, there are a lack of knowledge regarding local languages. So we try to contrast this type of gap, this type of problem, obviously, from our perspective. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Fabrizio, for adding this important multi-dimensional analysis on what can be learned from the Vietnam case. We have about 20-25 minutes for question and answers and comments. I had already started bringing the debate on the policy responses, but of course you are fully free to get to the different points touched upon by the four speakers. So I pass the floor to the audience, who's the first.
My question is for Dr. Sorry, you need to go and speak there because the people connected,
Yeah.
they will not hear.
Otherwise I will forget. So my question is for Dr. Combier. So in the presentation before yours, it was suggested that how an intervention by the international community can actually produce a positive outcome. But however, a short-sighted intervention by the international community can worsen the situation, as I think we saw in Libya. I guess it is clear that there are certain situations that allow the international community to just say, well, let's leave the locals to sort this out by themselves. Yet the international community isn't perfect, and some of the most powerful countries have interests, very specific interests in geopolitical, in geopolitics. So I wonder, when we talk about a multidisciplinary approach, as we have this morning, to solve these particular issues, are we referring to a compromise between political approaches fueled by specific and diverse interests and an approach that takes into account an international law and its interpretations? I don't know if I have been clear.
Yes, I think so. Thank you.
I don't know, we perhaps collect 3 questions and then.
Thank you for very interesting and stimulating contributions. I have a couple of questions. One is for Morten and Virginie. It concerns the, if you compare and contrast the Mali and the Libyan experience, and I think it is important to do that because we are talking about the 2 cases of states that imploded in the neighborhood, in the extended neighborhood of the EU, where there's an important jihadist component that shapes and is shaped by the insurgency. Don't you think that's something that puts your own contributions today in communication is the political economy side? Meaning, when we talk about the north of Mali, to some extent the center of Mali, we are talking about an extremely poor area where the economy of pillaging is limited to the fact that territory has a limited value. Well, in the Mopti area it could be a bit different, but the dynamic of the Niger inner delta is changing. If we talk about Libya, we're talking about a country that was, by, in comparative terms, relatively rich. By African standards, it was the richest by all indicators. So there's much more to be appropriated, depredated, and pillaged. And when that ends, and Tripoli might be a case, there's another economy based on fraud, based on, pressure on banking, on liquidity. So I'm wondering to what extent the difference in what can be appropriated shapes the insurgency, and to what extent governing on a shoestring is based on governing a territory where there's basically nothing, where the only value is based on circulation of commodities, as in the desert. So in the case of Libya would be the north and the south. A second little point is about, your presentation. I'm thinking about your genealogies of jihadist combatants, and I'm thinking about the biography of to stay in our neighborhood here, of Mokhtar Belmokhtar, the so-called Bin Laden of the Sahara. If you read the few interviews he released, one on the Salafist, the bulletin of the Salafist group of preaching and combat that survived the group Armée in Algeria. He says basically that the killing of Azam was the moment when he decided to be activated. And he became the generation that from nowhere in the middle of Algeria, went all the way to Afghanistan, came back without an eye, and then that was important to present himself, his DNA as a jihadist with Al-Qaeda background, getting married to a Barabish woman in the north of Mali, and going local. And then that was the first time that someone who had no noble descent could get married to a noble local woman. And that was the word of mouth that spread across the desert. So that's where you see the local, the global, the big ideologies scattered all across. He became so important that he's basically behind the moment where he became very important in terms of insurgency is the moment when the Paris-Dakar was interrupted. I think it's 2009. There was a airlift mechanism because Gaddafi himself said, wait a minute, we cannot guarantee that we can cross the desert. All Western diplomacies at that point said, okay, that idea of going from, what was it, Senegal to Cairo, they were changing the story. And then it was clear that the Sahara Desert was no longer safe. That's where tourism disappears and so on. So I'm wondering whether those genealogies intersect, where they intersect, and I'm not entirely sure I got your point at the end. How do those genealogies fit with the idea of the fact that you can negotiate with the Salafist and get to a group laying down the weapons and taking... so what is the relationship between genealogies if you look at people and the outcome? And lastly, just one word about your paper, Fabrizio. I think there's a very important merit in what you say, is that by coming and talking about counterinsurgency, you made a very point clear, that is that you cannot study insurgency without studying counterinsurgency. There's no way insurgency exists in a vacuum of state response. And that's what all studies we are doing in insurgents group tell us. You know, even if you interview prisoners, they tell you that the main question is state response. The killing of Azam is a case, but you know, major abuse it plays into the role. So the dynamic of military innovation and tactical innovation is such that you cannot observe insurgencies forgetting that they're fighting against someone. It's very, very strict, and it's a crucial aspect. Thank you.
Tino, you want?
Thanks a lot for all of your papers. I have some question for perhaps mainly to Virginie. Just because you speak about how, and also Martin actually, you both speak about how his local grievances are instrumentalized by the insurgents. So I just wondered, have you seen, Virginie, in Mali, in Libya, that they have, that they're playing on, you know, the history of certain areas, like, for instance, inflating the religious importance of certain cities, you know, playing on local patriotism in order to justify some religious projects that we see in Lebanon and Syria. And also maybe to Martin and maybe to Emin also. Which, if we look at the strategic level of jihadists, which documents do we have, or which strategies exist? Are we sure that, I mean, which documents do we have that show that jihadis are actually instrumentalizing tribal cleavages or sectarian grievances? Have they actually articulated this? And then my last question is, how is the enabling structure affecting the insurgencies, especially in Mali? Because you spoke, Martin, a lot about the poverty, the illiteracy, etc. Have you seen any studies of the combatants? Are they particularly illiterate or poor? Do we know how how this structural situation affects the insurgencies in particular. Thank you.
Okay, perhaps we start answering. Virginie, you want to take?
Yes, with regard to the first, oh, sorry. First question on the international intervention and the impact of international intervention. I think what most cases would illustrate in this panel even today is that, of course, in any conflict situation, there is a significant impact of international action on actors, on the influence of actors, how the role of international actors, not only by directly intervening militarily, for instance, but the issue of providing support, militarily, of course, financial, but also forms of recognition is key and has been used by various actors to increase the legitimacy, play against others. So in any situation of conflict, of course, international action is having an important impact on balance of power and is changing not only the balance of forces militarily, but also the relationships of power on the ground. So this is one thing. When I was talking about the need to look at these conflicts or these local dynamics in a multidisciplinary way, I was basically or mostly referring in terms of the analysis. To analyze and understand better what's happening on the ground, to understand better local dynamics, I think it's extremely important that we look at it through different lenses. Yet, I think this could also be applied to the more policy side in terms of how you design policies. And I think especially looking at the Libyan case over the past 7 years, one key issue or one key gap or lack of in the international strategy has been the limited capacity to design, let's say, multi-layered strategies. For instance, again, looking back at the Libyan case, there has been a quite long period in which most of the political diplomatic process was focusing on bringing the political actors to reach an agreement. So it was clearly a political strategy focused on bringing together political actors. And then, after time went by, more and more it became obvious that you could not do this without bringing in the security actors. So people started saying, oh, we can not only have a political track, you need a security track. Now we've entered into, let's say, a third stage of this reflection on what should be, how the strategy should be designed. Oh, you cannot look or solve the situation without including an economy track. And I think this is key, and this kind of very slow realization that conflicts are multi-layered and involve different types of actors also requires different types of strategies that are often more complex and, of course, more difficult to implement for political actors, but are essential to tackle the real roots of the crisis. So I would answer not so much multidisciplinary in terms of the policy responses, but definitely the need to look at what is being implemented on the ground on the various layers of what should be needed to address the various causes of the conflicts. Very briefly, the political economy dimension of the conflict, yes, clearly it's something extremely important. Actually, I forgot initially in my presentation, I wanted to insist not only on the importance of warfare and the importance of institutional collapse, but in the case of Libya, one third very important dimension is actually the presence and the acknowledgement by all the local actors that you have resources at stake. And it's been extremely important in shaping the conflict, and if you look at the evolution since more or less 2014, it has become increasingly obvious. So you cannot make the economy of introducing this more political economy dimension in the analysis. And again, I think in the policy dimension, if you want, or if there is a need to reflect on the political strategy, it has to include the political economy dimension of the crisis. And of course, what Francesco was mentioning, this kind of, if you look at the Libyan case, the different forms of the way armed groups are dealing with the environment and the various forms of predation, for instance, taking place in the north or in the south, also are deeply or immediately related to the nature and the availability of resources in these regions. For instance, in the Libyan case, since 2011, the city of Tripoli has always been a major stake in the competition for the various actors, because Tripoli is the center of power, it's the capital, but not only. It's seen of who is controlling the city, will control the main institutions, political, of course, security also, but even more important, economic and financial institutions. So this is why Tripoli has gained such an important key dimension in the competition for power between the various factions. Same thing with what is called the Old Crescent, which is this region more or less in the central part of Libya, where most of the oil resources are produced, but also where the oil resources are exported. So the kind of competition that organized around this area has been key for this precise reason, that you have something which is key for changing balance of power and gaining resources. In the south, and here we would maybe be much closer to the situation in some areas of Mali, you have a complete different area where resources mostly come from access or controlling strategic paths and roads connecting Libya to neighboring countries. So it's basically controlling the trafficking roads in the region. Trafficking can traffic many things differently, and this has changed also over the past few years. But again, I think it's important. I think it's central in how the country, the conflict has evolved, and it's extremely important to look at this dimension. Otherwise, you can't understand anything to what's happening in Libya now. And finally, the issue of grievances and the instrumentalization of grievances. Clearly, again, analyzing the Libyan conflict, it's been one of the core issues, or at least something that's been constantly used by the various competing factions, mobilizing historical conflicts between local communities, using narratives that have been also historical narratives of conflict between cities. For instance, if you look at the conflict, how it was reignited in some ways between the city of Misrata, which was one of the strongholds of the revolution, and the city of Beni Walid, one of the strongholds of the former regime. This has been used, mobilized, reshaped, and has been a key trigger of the continuation of the conflict. I'm not sure, however, that I can very easily identify a religious dimension in this. I'm not sure, at least in the Libyan case, I can see very clearly the community-based narrative can be the historical conflict being remobilized. I don't see clearly a religious dimension to it, but this is something that I could look at more in details. Thank you.
Maybe Martin, as you have a few questions which are intertwined.
Yes, Mali and Libya compared, and the beauty of limited resources to be appropriated. I think this is something we need to think about, Francesco, as we try to continue to develop this. Although I think we need to think about it, but we also should, when I started out this, it was never meant as sort of a claim, a universal claim. I don't really believe in that anymore. I think that it's much more fruitful to try to pursue what I call middle-range theorizing between a more select group of cases that share certain commonalities. That said, one thing is that, at least controlling the trade routes. For example, part of this Tuareg-Fulani feud, which sooner or later is going to blow up in the face of the Katiba Mazina and other of this group is, we are talking big bucks here. There's a lot of money involved. So, but still, that if you want to get that sort of grip on local population that you need in one way or another, because, many insurgencies quickly realize that, terrorizing people to consent is not very good for business, and it's costly as well. It's better to sort of try to see if you can at least bring some of them over, and then you need to be doing something that they think is at least half of what you're doing, have some sort of value for them, at least immediately. And you see the same thing in a place as a resource rich as North and South Kivu in DR Congo, where I've also done research. I mean, underneath all this immensely complex mosaic of different insurgencies and militias. I mean, in North Kivu, there is sort of between 30 and 40 of them. I mean, it's really a small place. Land rights is very much part of the picture. You cannot leave the diamonds and the gold and all this stuff aside, but I mean, if you look at what organizes things locally, it's not necessarily gold and diamonds. Very few battles has actually been fought over major mining sites. It's other things that are that lies underneath there, because after all, I mean, people need to eat, and you cannot eat the diamond, but you can eat the potato or the rice or whatever is at stake. So, but this is something we really need to think more about. But it is a good point, but it's difficult to see any pattern here. Maybe the pattern becomes clearer if we start when we take state responses into this. I mean, one example would then have been, for instance, the Lord Resistance Army that comes out of the Holy Spirit movement of Alice Laquena, which clearly was some sort of an egalitarian project. If you look beyond it, sort of the spiritual dimension, and it's sort of aimed to cleanse the Ugandan people, and surely in particular of their spiritual sins. I mean, and then it goes completely wrong for Joseph Kony and the Lord Resistance Army. Why is that the case? Well, the main case for this seems to be that's the camps that was made by the Museveni government, when they locked up almost 95% of the population in Acholi land in these camps for IDPs, which was basically prison camps, meant that their ability to have a grip on the population apart from stealing and looting from the camps became extremely limited. But still, I mean, so certain connections existed. So, I mean, it's we really need to, it's a very good question, and I'm very glad you asked it, but it's just something that we need to think more about, and we have to think quite creatively about the comparisons that we make, but maybe sort of putting state responses into a stronger relief may help us see a clearer picture here. The history of sort of this about the instrumentalization of local grievances. Well, I mean, again, in the case of Mopti and Segou, I mean, it's very clear how they at least initially started by drawing on the Dina, something that is at least sort of historically known and something that you can draw upon. The problem with this is, of course, that if you want to go big or bigger than that, then you quickly turn into that may turn into a problem for you. And right now, what we are seeing is that, I mean, they are trying to sort of enlarge the picture by finding a new enemy, an un-Islamic enemy, and that is the Doso, which is the hunter societies, which they then can claim are un-Islamic because they sort of control the spirits of the forest, which is in an Islamic reading, a pure Islamic reading of things. I mean, spirits are not something that should exist, basically. But many of them have tried to do this in various ways. So, I mean, if you have a history, make use of it. And, I mean, we have also seen in northern Mali in the period between 2012 and 2013 when jihadi groups controlled cities like Kidal, Timbuktu, Gao, that they also tried to make use of marabouts in order to, make the marabouts praise them and not those that they used to praise. So it is, again, quite a pragmatic turn to take for what is supposed to be a Salafi movement, playing with something that, since from their theoretical perspective, should be relatively unpure instead of being sort of the pure version of Islam. So there is a little bit of pragmatism to all of this, but they have made use of these kind of historical connections when possible. When it comes to this issue of sort of tribes, I mean, I'm personally quite careful with using the concept of tribes. I mean, because yes, I mean, you have these sort of, there are certain sort of overall grievances between Fulani, Bambara, Dogon, and so on and so forth. But I mean, if you look at most of the land rights conflicts that they make use of are not inter-ethnic or inter-tribe, to use that word. They are more intra. I mean, the whole inner delta of the region Ivory is sort of pestered with local rights-based conflicts. And most of them are within groups, in fact, not between groups. So I would be, it's more sort of how, I mean, they take what they can and then they make use of it. Basically, that's what they do. Finally, I mean, who are these combatants? Well, I mean, most of them, at least those that either are in prisons or are people who move in and out of them, because they are basically who you have access to. I mean, you don't have access to those that stay in the that remain in the bush. Because, I mean, if you want to have access to them, I mean, at the very best, you will have a very, very long field work before somebody are able to collect all the money they demand for you and take you back home again. And don't think, at least personally, I'm not in for a 7 to 10 year participant observation with these kind of groups. So, I mean, so we don't have access to them. So, but those that one can have access to are either people in prison or people that move in and out of them. And basically, they seem very few, if any of at least those that I have met or others that I know have met, have much knowledge about the Quran at all. Main reason for this is that they don't read Arabic. And some are just poor people who ended up there because there wasn't that much else to do. And then you have a few who ended up there just due to circumstances. Some of those maybe more sort of have more human resources. I mean, I met a couple of people who just got stranded in the northern part of Mali, who were on their way to Europe. I mean, they were not Malians, and then they ran out of money. And then came the jihadists and offered them between 100 and 500 US dollar per month to fight for them. And they saw that as a good alternative to live from hand to mouth on the streets of Gao, for example. So it's difficult to find sort of, but by and large, I would say that most of them are, those that are Malians are ordinary Malians, and that means that they are poor with little, if any, real education. That doesn't mean that they have not been through some schooling, but the problem with the school system in Mali, and that is something that has been a fact in this country for decades, is that those that has been at village schools, and that is what they have, even if they've been there for 6, 7, 8 years, they can barely read and write. And the reason for this is because the teachers don't know how to. And this is not an uncommon finding in large parts of West Africa if you move into the interior. In fact, we found exactly the same, for example, in Liberia, where we have a very good data set on former combatants. Where, yes, they had been through school, most of them, but they had spent time there, but they couldn't read or write, for example. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, if you want to take that. Please, we are already over time, so try to keep your answers.
I'll make it short. Well, the point that I really miss is to make a summary of my claims throughout the presentation, is that there are 3 levels of analytic perspectives, perhaps, that you have to be aware of, and that's that kind of socio-political context that we already have here through Libya and through Mali. And I look at that more in historical perspective. I look at Chechnya a lot. I look at Bosnia, and I look also at Afghanistan, and how this has developed. And this is really what makes the interpretation or manifestation of these 2 other analytic perspectives, and that's the modus vivendi and modus operandi. And modus vivendi is really the political theory theology, that I'm looking at. But modus operandi that the previous speakers talked about is something which is very context dependent, of course, and how this is expressed. And I got a question about Mukhtar bin Mukhtar and how his kind of a globalist perspective married or got rooted into the kind of a local context. That's one example, which I think, and he said he's the first one who really to marry into some type of nobility. But there are other examples. I mean, I focus a lot on Chechnya and Khattab's Saudi Arabian background and culture, being totally immersed in the Chechnyan culture. being married with several women there, adopting the language, learning Russian, for instance, in Chechnya, to gain legitimacy of the claims, broader claims that are made by Salafis, and showing the dedication to the cause by saying, I'm here to stay and I'm here to dedicate myself and my life to the cause of the local people, right? And it's interesting to see that this intellectual understanding of what Salafism is not always translated in the local context. And also, Salafis are oftentimes, as Morten was saying here, pragmatic in the sense of how they view things and how they interpret things. So, of course, the local infrastructure of legitimate leadership or civil society leadership, if you so wish, is always utilized in all these contexts. So there is this sharp distinction between what I call traveling warriors and those in the local context, because they come with totally different epistemologies to the problem of the locals, so to say. Because locals are there and they are married, they are invested in realities. So, and for instance, they are very much differently treated by the warring party or the state. So insurgents from Iraq, who are Iraqis themselves, are definitely differently treated by the regime than the traveling warriors who came there, who are oftentimes immediately executed if they are caught, while the locals are not as brutally or harshly treated because of this kind of a vested interest of the regime as well to maintain some kind of a coherent relationship with what they see as the internal enemy, so to say. So what kind of strategic documents are studied, this last question. Well, look, one concrete example is how can you study strategy through documents? You cannot really. You look at the case study and what's happening and the events. But one example that is quite obvious is the Zarqawi's letters to Osama bin Laden and Zawahiri, where he refused to obey the network leadership, the Al-Qaeda leadership, saying, do not attack Shiites, do not attack Shiite ritual sites. Do not do that, because that would create a lot of backlash. And Zarqawi totally disregarded that and went on and did exactly the opposite from what he was instructed from bin Laden and Zawahiri, for instance, right? So you can study that letter as kind of as empirical evidence that stuff is happening, how strategies, and that was, many analysts mean that is the core of birth of the difference and conflict between Al-Qaeda and ISIS later on. But yeah, that's just briefly.
Thank you, Francesco, for the comment. Just 40 seconds for answering. Yeah, I think that looking at the dynamic interaction between state, third actors and rebels is absolutely crucial, not only for conflict studies, but also for terrorism studies. And on this point, I think there are two interesting paths in research. First, we should look better at the novelties in the field of military adaptation that are mainly technology, so I referred before to drones, but also the case of foreign fighters, which is not a novelty per se, because also George Gordon Lord Byron was a foreign fighter, but in terms of number, as Hegammer, who also studied Hazam, say that especially concerning the case of ISIS, was a very relevant event in that sense. And finally, the second point is to try to combine a micro-level perspective on the individuals, what are the reasons behind individuals joined rebel groups or terrorist groups, with a meso-level perspective, also through the lens of organizational studies, looking at the structure of the organization in terms of resources, prestige, and in this case, the role of ISIS is extremely, extremely relevant. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. So we have come to the end of this very interesting panel. Please join me to thank for the panelists for the very interesting contribution.
Thank you, Luigi. Thank you, everybody. It's been a rather intense session with 4 contributions. Tomorrow we are going to have slightly shorter slots, 3, starting 8:30, breakfast session with 3 PhDs illustrating their preliminary results and also how they got to that. And then we start with the workshop itself Emanuele Somari is there, Marco Pertile is there. Everybody else is pretty much here. Someone else will join later. We go for dinner. For those who are coming for dinner, for our guests, we can meet at 7:45 if you want to walk with us in front of the scuola, the main gate, or the restaurant, you should have received that. The name is La Clessidra. So we can meet there at 8 o'clock, as you prefer. Anything else in terms of housekeeping? No, I think this is pretty much it. Okay, thank you very much, and let's meet tomorrow morning 8:30 and we resume our work. Thank you.